colleagues, guests,
Maybe it's in English.
welcome to our session, which is dedicated actually to discuss or to launch something called the Spotlight Report on Sustainable Development. And what is the Spotlight Report? My colleagues from the Reflection Group, the Global Civil Society Reflection Group on Sustainable Development will explain during their interventions on the Spotlight Report and something about the substance of the Spotlight Report. Allow me to present the panel first. So, sustainable development and social justice. I mean, this is the main objective of the Spotlight Report, to highlight the social justice and the role of the different actors who are working globally to protect human rights. Let me say that development, as it was defined by some philosophers, is the freedom. And freedom means, or development as a freedom means that freedom of choice and self-determination and the right to participate. And this is mainly lead us to transparency, accountability, and responsibility. Thus, development is about rights, and it's about rights-based approach, where the political and the cultural dimensions are integrated along with economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Social justice has three main pillars. The first one is peace and security, safety and stability, and the right of people to live in peace. The second is the rights-based approach, and which include the access to justice. And the third is the institutional framework based on efficiency, transparency, accountability, and responsibility. So the characteristics of the global system is the strong relation between power and money, and the monopoly, to a certain extent, of power and money, where the power became a tool to gain more money, and the money is the tool to reproduce the power. According to the World Bank, the definition of corruption is the abuse of power to make private profits or private benefits. Thus, the whole crony capitalism that you are talking about, created by the system, is a corrupted system as a whole, which, cause a lot of violations of human rights and cause a high concentration of wealth in the hands of the few on the account of the majority of the people. This phenomenon was associated to the neoliberal policies, leading to dismantling the state and the role of the state. And all the state institutions, including the productive sectors, on the account of the real estate, financial economy, and services. And these sectors are low in job creation, leading to unemployment, poverty, and the increase of the work in the informal labor. Informal labor means a labor which is not protected and where the rights are not secured. So mainly this is producing disparities at different levels, including regional, social classes, gender, etc. In our region, we can add that to this reality that the shrinking space for freedom and mainly shrinking the space for civil society is creating a big problem, and the resistance is weakened and weakened. And this is the main focus of the Spotlight report. And the big question is, can the Spotlight report become an important, and the reflection group can become an important global network and an important tool to advocate in order to reform the global system towards more social justice and for sustainable development. We have on this panel 4 prominent speakers. Roberto Bisio, who is the global coordinator of the Social Watch, and the Social Watch is the global network bringing together civil society from more than 80 countries around the world. Yokli, who is the director of the Third World Network, and the Third World Network is a global network working on mainly on systemic issues, such as global economy, trade issues, finance, climate, public health, food security, besides many other global issues. Barbara Adams, who,
words can't describe her.
she's from the global, she's from Social Watch and Global Policy Forum. And the Global Policy Forum is a small, let's say, think tank working mainly on and effectively on analyzing social justice. She is also an ex-UN employee, so she knows very well and deeply the UN and the global system. And Dr. Saadi, who is an economist from Morocco, former minister, and an activist, a researcher, working with many and supporting, by the way, civil society in Morocco, particularly with l'Espace Associatif and at the regional level with the Arab NGO Network for Development. So I will start by asking questions to our guest speakers, and I will be expecting a reply between 5 to 8 minutes, not more, and then we can have an interactive discussion and debate with the participants, so we can reply directly to their concerns. And my first question is to Mr. Bisio. Inequality is a global issue causing a lot of disparities and potential instability. So what are the main, let's say, reasons and consequences of inequality? And please, while you are talking about inequality, you can talk a little bit about the Spotlight report. So, please.
How many more minutes do you give me? Spotlight report.
You are my friend.
Good. It's here. Basically, the idea of this report, as with many other civil society reports, is the moments that the governments promise something, they, at the very same moment, become accountable to the citizens that have a right to ask, what are you going to do about that promise? Which is your promise. It's not our crazy demand. And so we can take the promise and come back 1 year after, 2 years after, and ask, okay, what have you done about it? So that, in the summary, is the Spotlight. We've been doing, and many of you probably know, a Social Watch report for many years after the governments promised back in 1995 two things, two quite simple things: to eradicate poverty and to achieve gender equality. And we said, okay, fair enough. That's pretty important in themselves, so we can come back and ask about it. Now, in 2015, the governments reiterated those promises and added some more, condensated in the so-called Sustainable Development Goals that are part of the new Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And so we said, okay, let's bring and help bring together in the reflection group for sustainable development and then in the editorial group of the Spotlight report, many more organizations that have specific knowledge of the different issues, of the different angles and so on, from a global perspective to complement what the national groups are finding out and reporting from their national experiences. And one of them complements and reinforces the other. Now, inequalities is one of these new promises that are included in the 2030 agenda and that were not before. You can say, well, maybe issues of inequalities were implicit already in the Human Rights Declaration in 1948, and when the Human Rights Declaration incorporates things like the right to social security and so on, so you're probably addressing inequality issues, but the word doesn't come out there. And actually, in the many decades of development and development policy of the United Nations, inequality was never a concern. And it's important to understand that because basically the whole theory was that we, developing countries, would have to go from a situation when we are all very equally poor, very poor and very equal, to a situation when we want to be like in Sweden or Norway or Finland, very rich and very equal. Now from here to there, some people will get rich first and others will get rich later on and so on. Well, that's not a problem. It's, you have to start somewhere. So there would be a curve where inequalities would increase until at a certain moment everybody or the whole country is rich, and then somehow it will start redistributing those riches and everybody would be rich and equal. Fine, so far that was the theory formulated by Kutzner back in the times of the New Deal in the US. But the fact is that that didn't happen. In the few cases where developing countries got rich, they got much more unequal. And in the last 20 or 30 years, what is happening is that inequality is increasing in rich countries. So you take all regions of the world, and inequality has been increasing in the last years in all regions of the world, except in Latin America, where I come from, which is the most unequal region of the world, but where in the last 15 years, inequality has been reduced, which somehow proves that it's not a natural law that inequality has to increase, but it's a result of public policies. Now, on the one hand, the issue is a very old and well-known issue. Already in the 19th century, some economists analyzed that the market, which at that moment was called capitalism, but that would produce inequalities. You know, a certain guy called Karl Marx formulated that very clearly, that it was natural for the working of the market to produce inequalities. And actually that was the whole 19th century. Inequalities increased as the market was taking over more and more of the world. Until we had the First World War, we had something happening in Russia that 100 years ago, and we had a peak of inequalities and a peak of financial crisis later on, and the governments decided that they had to do something about it. And the New Deal in the United States, for example, similar policies in the rest of Europe, Social Security was introduced, progressive taxation was introduced, the rich were made to pay more, and public education was provided, public health was provided, Social Security measures, all kinds of different mechanisms, and inequality dropped dramatically during several decades until in the late 80s, something happened and inequality started to go up again. And what basically happened around that time was called globalization, which basically was a series of political measures to deregulate finances to start with, trade, to give the market a lot of the power that it has left, and to cut taxation from the rich in many countries, and to cut social services to the poor. And oh surprise, inequality started to increase, which is kind of very logical. But it started to increase so much and so fast that people started to protest, rebel. You know, at some moment, guy in Tunisia was beaten by the police because he didn't have authorization to sell fruit and so on, and that started a process of which you know much better than me, but where deep inequalities are at the heart. The situation became so bad that even institutions like the IMF or the World Bank that were behind a lot of those measures that created the so-called food riots and so on, started to worry about inequalities and started to say that inequalities are hindering further economic growth. They are not just a problem of justice, but a problem of efficiency in the very functioning of the economy. And so it comes to the introduction of the goal number 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals. The best thing about goal number 10 is the title. And the title is, we are going to reduce inequalities within and among countries. It doesn't say when. It doesn't even say how we are going to measure. It doesn't say how we are going to achieve that, either nationally or internationally. But the promise is there. And if you want to ask how we are going to get it, I think it's quite easy. And I already mentioned, it was done before. It can be done again in all the different countries. But of course, it takes policy measures. And it so happens that the people that are at the top of the scale, opinion polls and different kind of researches conducted in many universities show that they don't like the measures that would reduce inequalities. It's a surprising conclusion, considering that the system that makes them rich is jeopardized by such a big inequality, but those people don't like those kind of measures, and they actually pressure to lower their taxes even more, and they actually pressure to reduce social policies even more, and so on, all around the world in different countries, poor and rich. The US is discussing in these days a tax reform that will make them pay less taxes, and Brazil and Argentina are discussing reforms of Social Security that will make the need to redistribute money to the very poor that would reduce that in quite a contradiction with all the other sustainable development goals. But you see, from different parts of the world, the issue is not going in the way that the SDG is promising it should go, with a few exceptions. But that is precisely the area of politics. Is it too late? Has plutocracy evolved so much already, as Ziad was describing, where those people have already so much political power and so on that nothing can change anymore? I don't want to believe that. No, and I want to be a bit more optimistic and to believe that this can still be changed, and that is precisely why we keep working on it, trying to join forces between different civil society groups, and trying to make out of this goal, which some people at some moment call it's the orphan goal. Orphan in the sense that, say, you take health and you have the World Health Organization and the health ministry at home, so you know whom to address about health, and the same for education, or the same for housing, and so on. But no country has an authority on inequalities. You don't have somebody to go, whose door you should knock to say, I want this reduction of inequalities delivered. But everybody should therefore have a responsibility for it, and that's one of those issues that has to bring all the others together. And of course, inequalities, and that I'll finish there, we usually think of it in terms of money, and yes, of course, money is an expression of it. And then you come into the technicalities, it is your income, and yes, there has been an increase in differences in income. Is it your wealth, the riches, the money that you have? And again, that has been increased. But it's also a lot related to a lot of factors. Are you equal in terms of the law? Are you discriminated because of your gender, because of your color of your skin, because of your beliefs or tradition or family or procedence or way or country where you were born? You know, there are many, many factors that are confluent in creating or strengthening the inequalities, and a lot of that is also at the same time very difficult and very easy to combat and to solve. And it's ultimately a problem of political will, and it is ultimately a problem of power and access to resources. Thank you, Ziad. I hope I did not extend
No, it's
too
fine.
much.
Thank you. I will come back to you later, but let me ask Jockling about, you always talk about and write about systemic issues as a main obstacle in front of the implementation of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 in general. So can you explain in 8 minutes what are the systemic issues and how do they block the success of the efforts?
Ziad always asks very simple questions, which are PhD sort of.
Because we are friends.
Yes, at least 10 PhDs. Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. Actually, when we look at this whole 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, it all really, this idea that the current economic model, development model is unsustainable from the justice, social, environmental point of view, and even as economics is bad economics, it's not a new idea. And in terms of the United Nations and its recognition and an action plan and promises, I mean, 25 years ago in Rio, the first big summit on environment and development, if you look at this document called Agenda 21, somewhere inside there is the term paradigm shift. And a sentence that says recognizing that the economic model is not sustainable. This is 25 years ago. So we had a promise of a paradigm shift. But what happened, of course, as has been mentioned by our other colleagues, is that we had this whole thrust of globalization, so there was a clash of paradigm. So we had the beginning of understanding sustainability and vulnerability with the 3 pillars from the United Nations, and at the same time, this thing called the Uruguay Round was being completed in your country, and we had this whole new package of so-called trade agreements, which was nothing to do but with just trade alone, but was about intellectual property, services, government procurement, bits of it. And that whole package really was a completely clashing paradigm. And so the systemic sort of flaws of trade, finance, which were recognized in the United Nations in 1992, those unfair structural problems with trade and finance and who controls technology got actually deepened through what became the WTO that enforces that package of agreements. So this clash of paradigm just keeps going, and in a way, in many respects, the winner, until we got to 2015, is really the package that continues with the unsustainable system. And that's why, and recognizing that, we have the whole idea of transformation. Transformation, again, challenges us, and our governments have accepted it at the highest level. We need to transform very fundamentally the wrong system. And so inequality, which actually had deepened, has become the rallying force. But what do? We see that basically things continue to be the same. And so what we, very quickly I'm going to touch on how we did analysis. I mean, we are here in the Center of also policy analysis work. So it's not that the academia and NGOs who are working in these areas, even the farmers who are facing the reality of the systemic flaws, we've been talking about how terms of trade are very unfair. Trillions, we talk about the net flow from the south to the north in the system. Trillions of dollars, if you want to use the dollar to measure, actually goes from the south to the north. And it has gone in terms of natural resources, and it continues. Today, in the last 10 years, actually commodity dependency continues to be a characteristic of most of the South. And we look at Venezuela, we look at most of Latin America, we look at Ghana. Because commodity prices went up, it was always very suppressed. And so we were always complaining until the 90s that we were producing commodities very low prices. We had then to buy finished products, so the terms of trade were very unfair. And also with intellectual property coming up again, from medicines to seeds to technologies, we were paying more and more through royalties. So the net flows continue to go that way. And then we had, I don't know whether you can say it's good or bad, 10, 15 years of high commodity prices, which gave the illusion that we were moving forward in many parts of the South. But then the vulnerability actually increased. And then we see the closer integration of new big financial players into the commodity market. And so commodity became another bubble. And the bubbles from property to the stock market, and now we were just touching a little bit in our discussion the last 2 days, which we haven't even gone into, is cryptocurrency, bitcoins. So we're talking about more and more sort of distance from the real economy and from real people. And this creates new levels of risk. So the issue of debt, new debt, in middle-income countries like China and others, which were supposed to be the darling of, Asia was the darling of, good development. And we did tremendous stuff in actually reducing poverty. But we have new systemic vulnerability. So the issues of debt, unfair trading terms, and now, added to that, intellectual property. And I just want to give a quick example because we don't give up hope, because there is a pushback. So one of the biggest fights in the last couple of years has been over a treatment for hepatitis C. And the big clash is actually between Gilead Sciences, which is this big American company, and its biggest fear is actually an Egyptian generic company. Because in Egypt, there is no patent allowed on this particular hepatitis C medicine. So you can buy it. Malaysia just issued a license, our government, to buy this product for 12 weeks. You can buy it from Egypt for $120. This same product is $84,000 in the United States. And in Malaysia, to buy that patented product is $70,000 US. But the Egyptian company can sell it to us for 120. And this cures you in 12 weeks. So the biggest challenge to Gilead Sciences is Fargo from Egypt. And this report of ours, the Spotlight report, really shows that the systemic flaws is not just a theoretical thing, it's like who then holds the power. So the big corporations change the rules, write the rules, and this is what the whole WTO set of rules are. They are rules written by corporations, and they actually, attack our societies, and then the law legalizes it, and even that is not enough. And so we see this whole explosion of trade agreements at the regional and north-south bilateral agreements that create even more corporate rights. And many of us sitting in this room have been writing, analyzing, and fighting against the right of investors to sue a government for making environmental health policies, for making policies to have stable financial systems. So this attack where you give rights to companies to sue governments over their responsibility for policy making and lawmaking is really, I think, the manifestation where systemic flaws actually create more power for big corporations. And we are talking about human rights. Human rights are actually pitted against corporate rights. Whereas corporations really just should be having privileges. A patent or a copyright is a privilege, but it's become intellectual property rights. Farmers' rights have become a farmer's privilege to save some seeds, but big agribusiness have rights and patents over seeds. And so the whole issue of who has rights really is being turned around. And so I think for us in our work, we actually begin to see that governments which have actually surrendered in the name of globalization, they've signed agreements in the trade, they've signed agreements in investment, but they've given away those public space. And so our report is about reclaiming that public space. We heard today in this region where so much of the systemic flaws from the economic point of view creates a lot of political and social instability. And so we heard about rebuilding the state today. And for many of us where we do not have the same level of having to rebuild the state, are talking about reclaiming the state. And reclaiming the state is a national battle, and we have to reclaim the United Nations because that's where we come together as a global community to make the norms and the institutions that keep us safe. And so, so systemic risks and flaws are not new. They have deepened, but we also have a new level of organizing and energy among people, academics, researchers, and policymakers, and parliamentarians, and local governments. And that's a very powerful force for us to really make the promise actually come true.
Thank you. Barbara Adams. So my question to you is about, we are talking about a global system, systemic issues, inequalities created by a global system. And first, how do you see, who is the global system? I mean, do you consider that the United Nations is still an active and decisive institution which is really influencing the global policies, or we are talking about different institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, etc.? So how we can, let's say, talk about more democratic global system, more transparent, more accountable global system where we can really bid on change and transformation?
I don't think I should say thank you for a question like that. Jockling was right. These are tough questions. To the extent that Roberto laid out and Jockling gave us examples of if the concentration of economic wealth and the related power are what shape policies and systems, clearly we're in a very tough space. The United Nations was set up to basically, with the UN Charter, work for peace and security, and has established many norms and standards, particularly around human rights and environmental areas, that are supposed to be the framework, the rule base, that member states engage in when they engage in each other. So the dilemma that we're hearing already is that the extent to which economic power and concentration have not only captured the marketplace and essential services, but also to many extents also governance, then obviously that's very, very tricky. You both mentioned globalization. There's a quote here from the first report of the new Secretary General. We have a new Secretary General at the moment who is talking reform. He's going to be the Reform Secretary General, perhaps. And in his report on the organization, basically it says globalization has been cruelly unfair. As wealth has increased, so too has its asymmetry, leaving millions behind in all parts of the world. Now that all by itself is relatively unusual for the Secretary General, frankly. Certainly Ban Ki-moon would never have said such a thing. The current Secretary General is very, very focused on prevention. He's worked previously in the areas of conflict, and he basically is very clear that the only way to address conflict is to prevent conflict, that you can respond to conflict situations, but basically the dynamics around recurring, that it has to be related to prevention. And it's also very interesting that the push on prevention is looking at root causes. So the push on prevention is not a matter of placing peacekeepers, for example, in certain spaces, but really looking at the issues of root causes. And in fact, in this same report, there are some very clear, straightforward statements about how things like the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has been referenced here, implementing it are key in this prevention strategy. So in the way that I put the language, I would like to say that perhaps for the first time we're getting a recognition not only of physical bloody violence, as it were, but we are getting a recognition of economic, social, and ecological violence, and how that also needs to be addressed in these areas. Now, if you're going to prevent conflict, I would say, and you asked me about civil society and social movements, if we're talking about prevention, then we're clearly talking about being more serious about early warning. We are talking about being a lot more serious in the pre-conflict stage. And if there's ever a space and importance for civil society and people who are working in communities in a whole variety of situations, this is that space. That it should make a huge difference in terms of the role, if you like, for early warning. And I would also add to that, not only that, but also, and there's a lot more recognition in language, of the importance as well of women's rights in this area, because basically women are on the forefront of conflict. They're on the forefront of the failure of systems, whether it's in the healthcare system, whether it's in education, whether it is in a more systemic approach in terms of the way in which warfare has taken place. But basically, and if there's anybody that understands systemic failure, I think we could say that that would be the case in lots of areas. But usually the gender issue gets on the agenda as a victim, not as the agent of transformation. So these are all the kinds of things, frankly, that are now being explored in some very, very interesting ways. And the second thing I'd like to say then about what happens with civil society is I think we should start building the agenda. Too often we respond to the agenda. And too often we find ourselves involved in implementing programs we don't really believe in because we know they didn't really get to the root causes of what is really needing to be done. And so this is part of what we discussed when we came together as a group around the Spotlight report. We work in different kinds of ways in these areas, and we are aware of the limitations of how far we feel we can sometimes go in some of these. That's how far we can and can't go. Somebody agrees with me, perhaps. And so when we came together in the Spotlight report, we wanted to examine the root causes and what we needed to talk about here and not be satisfied with things being a little bit less bad, frankly. And so one of the things, and it's already been referred to by Jockling, one of the things that we really looked at then was we have to address the obstacles. We have to address the obstacles that are experienced by people enjoying their rights. We have to address the obstacles in terms of everything from children, girls going to school, to having access to medicines, etc. And that is what brought us in the last report, for those of you that have seen it, to really analyze the role of the corporate sector in terms of obstacles to achieving each of these goals, goal by goal and across the way in a systemic area. And one of the things that we're looking at there, and this is where I think we have to work more on building the agenda, is that we're also aware in the world in which we are now functioning that policies and actions in one country will have effects in another. The policies in Britain with regard to interest rates, etc., influence the financial system in other countries over which they have no control. This is something the IMF politely calls spillover effects, as if it's a bit of spilt milk, you know? I mean, it's not, it is much more serious. And so one of the things we need to build is also to have the rights framework catch up with this cross-border, this spillover effect, the extraterritorial obligations that countries have on the effects in others. And this is something else that we in the reflection group and in the Spotlight report have really, really looked at here. So we're looking to close the gap between the sustainability agenda and the human rights agenda. We have a lot of good things, but we haven't always brought them together in the right policy spaces. Now, back to the Secretary General. Quite interesting. In his report, he lists 11 main challenges that happen everywhere, but that vary according to region and other factors. And in the 11, one of them that he names, and it's the ones you would think of in terms of unemployment and inequality and climate change, one of the 11 is the limited space for civil society. This is a little different, okay? So in that particular context, I think we need to also be alert to what we want that space for. We really need to distinguish between civic space and corporate space. And yet usually this all kind of gets lumped together as kind of non-state actor type space. Who's making space for whom? We need to be alert in terms of all of this, to the extent to which that civic space is related to advocating for public services, not providing the services ourselves on the longer term basis. Well, there might be situations where that may be a way of getting started. We need to be alert when we are talking about that space that we don't fall into the vicious circle and downward spiral of understanding the weakness of the state in so many areas that we become cynical and don't go there and help to contribute to the undermining. That's a toughie. And we discuss it as well in the reflection group and in the Spotlight report in terms of how do we actually reclaim the public space and then not occupy it, but be involved in the process of it. And I can't predict what the next Spotlight report is going to be about. I can predict it's going to have a lot of very difficult and interesting conversations along the way. And I hope that you will find it interesting reading when we bring it out. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, you deserve it. Let me shift to Dr. Saadi. He's going to, his reply will be in Arabic, so prepare yourself. And it's easy, so you can give to your neighbor. I mean, I will ask the question in English, giving you time to prepare yourself. So it's about the Arab region. You know, the Arab region is facing deep and complicated challenges. And on the basis of, this reality, there are many, many factors. Some of them are very local, but also many of them are related to the global system, and again back to the systemic and the global system issues. How can you explain what's happening in the Arab region in 8 minutes?
شكرا زياد. في الحقيقة هذا سؤالك هو مشروع كتاب.
يلا كيف نبلش؟
يعني خليني أقول بس أن ما وقع بعد الربيع العربي يسائلنا، لأنه كانت هناك آمال كبيرة فيما يخص تحقيق مطامح الشعوب العربية في الحرية وفي الكرامة وفي العدالة الاجتماعية، وما رأيناه أكاد أقول العكس، ربما باستثناء تونس الشقيقة التي تمكنت من تحقيق خطوات مهمة في المجال الديمقراطية السياسية. والملاحظ هو أن السلطوية استعادت عافيتها في المنطقة، والسياسات النيوليبرالية أعطي لها نفس جديد، خاصة في بلدان كمصر كتونس كالمغرب، من خلال اتفاقيات مع صندوق النقد الدولي من أجل قروض بمشروطية ربما تعيدنا إلى الثمانينات من القرن الماضي أو أسوأ، فيما يخص التقويم الهيكلي جديد مبني على رفع الدعم على المواد الأساسية، تجميد كتلة الأجور والتوظيف في الوظيفة العمومية، خصخصة التعليم والصحة، إصلاح بين مزدوجتين أنظمة التقاعد، مرونة الشغل، وخلق بيئة لتحفيز القطاع الخاص. وهذا ما كنا نقوم به منذ الثمانينات دون نتائج تذكر، بمعنى أننا كأننا ندور في حلقة مفرغة. وبالتالي أنا أعتقد بأن هذه المرحلة قد تفضي إلى حركات اجتماعية جديدة، وأن الثورات العربية لم ينتهي زمانها. لا نعرف متى سيحدث أو ستحدث الاحتجاجات الاجتماعية أو الحراك الاجتماعي السياسي المقبل، ولكن هناك إرهاصات. في المغرب كانت لنا لحظتان قويتان: 20 فبراير في 2011 وهي الصيغة المغربية للربيع العربي، وحراك الريف الذي انطلق منذ 10 أشهر في شمال المغرب، وحركة اجتماعية قوية من أجل الحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية. فبالتالي يعني هناك عوائق عميقة مرتبطة بطبيعة أنظمتنا السياسية من حيث توفير المجال للمجتمع المدني، للحركات العمالية والاجتماعية للتعبير عن حقوق الناس، للنضال. وهناك ربما كذلك أكاد أقول تحدي ثقافي حضاري، بمعنى أننا لنا صراع بين قوى المحافظة وقوى الحداثة، بين توجهات أصولية دينية وربما توجهات تنويرية لا زالت في المهد. وهذا كله للأسف ربما معاق أكثر على الصعيد الإقليمي والعالمي. تكلمت قبل قليل عن IMF، صندوق النقد الدولي، وكاد أقول أنه نفس الشيء بالنسبة للاتحاد الأوروبي. يعني لما نقارن ما بين سياسات الاتحاد الأوروبي تجاه المنطقة جنوب وشرق المتوسط والأجندة 2030، يعني تناقض صارخ إذا قارنا بين السياسات المبنية على الليبرالة وليبرالة الآن الخدمات بما فيها القطاعات الاجتماعية، الفلاحة، تطبيق المعايير الاتحاد الأوروبي، إدماج سنغافور إيشوز فيما يخص المشتريات الحكومية، فيما يخص حقوق الملكية، فيما يخص قوانين المنافسة إلى آخره. هذا عائق ربما أكاد أقول في نفس الأهمية والخطورة كالمشاكل التي نعرفها داخليا، وربما القضايا مرتبطة ببعض. وعجبتني كثيرا الإشارة إلى الكوربريت كابتشر، بمعنى أنه الاتحاد الأوروبي هو رهينة للشركات المتعددة الجنسية الأوروبية. لا تنسوا أنه في براسلز عاصمة أوروبا الاتحاد الأوروبي أكبر الشركات المتعددة الجنسية الأوروبية لها مكاتب لللوبين على طول السنة. وبالتالي لما الاتحاد الأوروبي يضع استراتيجيته ك big global player، كلاعب عالمي، وهذا هو التعبير، لاعب عالمي، فلا يرى مصلحة المغرب ولا مصلحة تونس ولا. وبالتالي الإشكال هو أنه هناك حلفاء محليين. الاتحاد الأوروبي لا يفرض كل شيء، هناك من يستفيد، وبالتالي هناك نوع من التكتل والتحالف المصلحي الذي يعيق في العمق التحرر، لأن إشكالية التحرر. نحن الآن أمام استعمار جديد، نيوكولونياليزم، ليس له طابع عسكري بل له طابع اقتصادي ثقافي كاسح. فلهذا أظن أنه لتبيان الحلول، وهذا هو ربما بيت القصيد، أهمية أننا نتوفر على الحيز السياساتي، البوليسي سبيس، وبصفة يعني مبسطة جدا. بلداننا وقعت على اتفاقية تبادل حر. المغرب مثلا وقع على 55 اتفاقية، 55. تصوروا معي في جل هذه الاتفاقيات المغرب له عزج تجاري مزمن، جلها، بمعنى أنه أول مدخل هو نطلب بمراجعة هذه الاتفاقيات. لم نستفيد شيئا، وما هو مقترح من طرف الاتحاد الأوروبي هو ربما أخطر، DCFTA Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement، اتفاقية تبادل الحر المعمق والشامل، بمعنى القضاء على كل إمكانية بناء قدرات إنتاجية محلية لتلبية الحاجيات السوق الداخلية. إذن هذا ربما مستوى أول. مرتبط بهذا، وبعد دقائق سأنهي، على المستوى العالمي. أنا كنت قرأت قبل أيام تقرير مهم جدا للأونكتاد، ومن بين توصيات الأونكتاد هو أنه ضرورة القطع مع السياسات التقشفية على الصعيد العالمي من خلال استراتيجية موحدة ومنسقة على الصعيد العالمي مبنية على الإنفاق العمومي للتجهيز العميق تستفيد منه كل الدول. النقطة قبل الأخيرة أو إشكالية إقليمية ربما سأعتبر كواحد من الحالمين، بس أظن أنه الاندماج الإقليمي العربي لا مفر منه. طبعا هناك عوائق سياسية هناك، ولكن من الناحية الاستراتيجية ومن ناحية التفكير على المدى البعيد هذا شيء ربما الحكومة ستذهب وتبقى المشاكل، وبالتالي هذا جانب ربما لا نوليه ما يكفي من العناية، علما بأن التكتلات الآن جهوية، مع ربما إضافة بسيطة أن التكتل لا يمكن أن يبنى فقط على التبادل الحر وعلى ميكانيزمات السوق. نستعمل فعلا ميكانيزمات السوق، ولكن نعطي الغلبة لإمكانيات التعاون والتآزر وتبادل الخبرات، وربما تعبئة الموارد المالية الطائلة الموجودة في المنطقة، والجلوبال فاليو يعني الريجونال جلوبال ريجونال فاليو تشينز. ثم شيء أساسي وهو قضية الديمقراطية وتوفير البيئة للعمل المجتمع المدني على الصعيدين الإقليمي والمحلي. وأخيرا على الصعيد الوطني، وأظن هذا بالنسبة لي شعار فيه أشياء كثيرة، ولكن ما فيش الوقت أن أفصل. يعني بمعنى وطنيا أظن أنه نحتاج إلى دولة ديمقراطية تنموية عادلة اجتماعيا، وبالتالي لما أقول دولة تنموية أقول أن تبني سياسات تمكننا من بناء القدرات الإنتاجية من أجل التحويل البنيوي في الاقتصاد، وما يستدعيه هذا من بناء لقدرات البشر على المستوى الذهني، الفكري، الصحي، التعليمي، الثقافي، والجانب المؤسساتي وديمقراطية المجتمع. شكرا.
Okay, by this I open the floor for any comment or question or critique. Yes, Nabil. Hey, Nabil, raise your hand so he can see you.
Thank you. I have two questions. First, it's about what Ziad asked about the global system and what you were saying. I have always this questioning, I keep asking it, that if the real action, between brackets, happens in WTO, IMF, investment treaties, etc. And all the other stuff is more of standards and general principles. Like if you take it from the ILO to the SDGs, to the MDGs, to the Declaration of Fundamental Rights at Work, etc. What is the use or the utility of engaging with SDGs and other such instruments if everything that happens is elsewhere, like you see in the WTO? And I think, I mean, the most striking symbolism of this is in Geneva, where you know the WTO center used to be the ILO, and you have like a status of workers in the WTO center. So this is a really symbolic for how the world is going. So aren't we wasting efforts? This is a question. The second question is about democracy itself. So Roberto, you talked about the US and like the efforts to slash taxes for corporations and increase it for low-income people and middle class, etc. And this is by democratically elected government. And we see those all elected, democratically elected governments doing that. So the right-wing governments. So, and is it, should we like question liberal democracy, and in a sense that we always keep saying, like Dr. Saadi said, we need a democratic developmental state. Does this really exist? Because developmental states have been really not really democratic, and democratic states haven't been developmental. So can we really merge the two? And thank you.
Whoa, you can answer that.
This is another PhD project. Any other questions? Yes, please. Yes, and then Atif.
I guess it was Barbara Adams that was mentioning the role of civil society, and I wanted to touch on human resources. Where do you think that the expertise and the technical human resources are sitting now, and where should they sit? Because I know, working with USAID several years ago, we were saying that a lot of the technical capacity had gone from working in governments, whether it's the US or developing countries, to working in other places that the government would subcontract to, for example, because maybe the salaries would even be higher. So I'm just wondering, there's one thing which are where are the experts, and the other is where's the actual work being done. So when we talk about health in the US, to give an example, even if you have an inclusive health policy, a lot of things are in different states being done different ways. So in some cases, the state may provide direct health care, and in some cases it's outsourcing and it's a third-party payer, it's an administrator. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about the human resources to pull this agenda forward.
Dr. Atif.
Ziad, I have a question for Roberto. If civil society was able to present alternatives to what came in Goal 10. I have a remark to Yuko on the hepatitis C example. I don't think it's a good example unless you're giving it as what the owner of the patent did for his home country. And if other people in the world can do similar gestures, but this is not a good example of how maybe we can cut down the price of medicine for people in underdeveloping or in dire need of medicine, and how alternatives could be put forward, not just because the inventor of the medicine wanted to benefit Egypt, which is his home country. The third question that I have, did I clarify my question? Yeah, the third question that I had is to Mr. Saadi, and I'm not only glad to hear his remarks on what should be done in the Greater Arab Free Trade Area الاندماج الإقليمي والعربي لا مفر منه, but ليش ما عم بيصير هالاندماج? Why aren't we able to get that Greater Arab area in place? And is it because we are unable to realize the infrastructure that is needed, or is civil society just sitting around and watching how in different countries politicians are not really addressing the regional accords? Are the accords that you're discussing here only global accords that we need to address, and when will ANND maybe address a regional infrastructure on the Greater Arab Free Trade Area that could include democracy or include bills of rights at the level that we need to address, and consumers' rights if that is part of what is to be discussed? So one comment and two questions.
Thank you. Please.
And thank you, Rob. Thank you. The third speaker. I have Barbara. I have a lot of questions, but I'll maybe write to you about them.
You mean the second? Okay. So you are not.
Okay, great. Well, that was a very impressive presentation, as always. I somehow never get tired of listening to you and listening and taking part in the presentation of this report that we're very proud to be a part of as a global trade union organization. I think it's really very important that that the voice of workers and also of the human resources, the representatives of those people that represent the human resources needed to implement this agenda, to make sure that the SDG on water, on health, on education, on energy, and so forth will actually be implemented. And what needs to be done to ensure that these human resources are put in place is a debate which is very much at the center of concern at the United Nations. There was as a follow-up to the adoption of the SDGs, there's been a UN High Commission on employment in health and economic growth, which looked exactly at this very issue. And what's really important to note is that within the work that we did towards the report of this commission, that the role of the public funding and the need to align public and private provision of healthcare were very much at the center of this debate. And basically, in the end, there was in this report there's a strong recognition of the importance of funding public health systems, which produce better health outcomes. So, I think once we get deeper into debates around different areas of implementation of the SDGs, we can come forward with evidence in terms of, and arguments in terms of how these SDGs need to be implemented and what human resources are required for that. And I think that on a number of areas we have certainly made progress, even in circles where we're confronted with people from the OECD, the WHO, and others. So, also to comment on your question, why are we continuing to operate in these spaces when the real decisions are taken at a WTO, at a OECD, the World Bank, and the IMF? I think we are responding to World Bank policies and IMF policies in our arguments that we're producing here, and actually we're speaking in one voice in all these different platforms. I think what's new now is that we're speaking in one voice here, there, in all these different platforms, and as much as the World Bank and the IMF would like, we are bringing these economic arguments and the financial structure and the means of implementation to the fore, also within the debate on the 2030 agenda. It's unavoidable. So I think that's it's one of the strengths also of using the human rights agenda and the discussion on the means of implementation all in one. So I think there's a stronger recognition of the fact that yes, there is no facade of human rights and behind another reality. We operate within one reality. So so I think it's definitely useful, and we have to. Yes, and the third thing that I wanted to say is about this meeting, and I think it's been an extremely useful meeting. Which really exposes also the actions of civil society, of trade unions on a range of different activities, and the fact that there's so much more areas where we can explore cooperation and where we need to cooperate. And I think tax justice in this region has really come out as one of the most strategic areas of cooperation for PSI and all of the people in the room. So I really look forward to work with you on all of that. And I'm sure my colleagues who are here look forward to work with you on that.
Your colleagues from PSI?
Yes, my colleagues from
Public
PSI
Service International. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me go back to the panel with few additional questions. For each one of you, I have a small question to add when you are maybe you can take into consideration. Roberto, you mentioned something about the finance. sustainable development agenda and from where we can get funding, and it's not very well mentioned. And but the question is that when talking about the finance for development, they are more focusing on the private sector and the role of the private sector. So what does it mean? I mean, what about other dimension of financing for development that they were mentioned in the previous agenda? Talking about the debt, talking about many other issues. Barbara, I want to ask you one simple question as usual. In this discourse, United Nations and this mainly agenda, they are talking about leaving no one behind. Is it realistic, and how it can be? And what does it mean in fact? And for you, actually, you've been talking about the systemic issues and the new, let's say, issues. I heard that you've been talking about something called the e-commerce, where they are trying to include everything, Singapore issues, etc., on the agenda, and now we are expecting the ministerial meeting next week. So do you really think that this is something that it can pass, or where we are? And my last question to you, Dr. Sadi, you've been talking about the regional integration and the pan-Arab. What about the South-South cooperation? So can it be perceived as part of this or preparation or one step towards, or South-South cooperation can be a solution for the developing countries in this regard? So I can give you the floor now, and I will shut up forever.
For tonight.
For tonight.
Is a development state, democratic development state possible? Yes, it is. And basically, if you have a government that manages to deliver development, and by that I mean redistribute resources, have economic growth that is not destructive of the environment, and so on, I can tell you that people would usually appreciate that and vote them, again. So, I hate to put my own country as an example, but I'm not in the government, I'm not in the governing party, I'm an independent observer. But Uruguay is a small country, 3.5 billion inhabitants, surrounded by two big powers in the region. Okay, you can imagine. And we have a government, a coalition government, that if I describe it to you, you would say that beast does not exist. It's like the giraffe, that when you describe it, you say that's impossible. So it's a coalition of 24 different parties, which includes the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Socialists, the Communists, the former people that were doing armed struggle, 4 different Trotskyite parties, and some people that come out of the traditional conservative parties. So you put all that together, But somehow this coalition is in power for 12 years now, 3 consecutive times, has been elected. We rank very high in the freedom indexes, freedom of press, all the TV and the newspapers are in the hands of the opposition, and they permanently criticize everything. We rank very low in the corruption indexes. And the thing is that for 12 consecutive years, every year there has been some economic growth, not much, but some. Every year there has been reduction of inequalities, reduction of poverty, more people unionized, each and every year, and we now have 100% power generation by renewable sources. And foreign investment is coming in, contrary to everything that the World Bank will tell you about the need to constrain the unions and constrain social security and so on. And the taxes have been increasing on a progressive scale on the rich. We didn't even have income tax 10 years ago. So income tax was introduced and so on. So it can happen. At least I can give you an example. It's not perfect, you know. It's far from perfect. And but you know, you look at it, and it's all old guys in their 70s. The young people in the cabinet are those of my generation, over 60, you know, and basically are almost all men, you know. And at the same time, that government produced the legalization of abortion, the legalization of marriage. You can marry anyone you want from any gender or preference. Legalization of marijuana also, but that's a different kind of thing. At the same time, smoking is prohibited everywhere, you know. Anyhow, yeah, kind of. Not in a closed space. But, you know, you can buy it on pharmacies or grow it at home yourself, whatever you prefer. So it can happen. It can happen against what they tell you. Oh, this is not going to happen. You know, investment will run scared. Not at all. We have every bank in the world. We have too much financial freedom, and we have more investment than what we would like in some cases, because not everything runs fine, but it runs. Now, you were talking about finance.
And partnership. Partnership.
And partnership. Well, it comes together. But the whole story that you hear about this new agenda is that, oh, we want to achieve all these wonderful things, leave no one behind, provide health, provide education, provide this, provide that, all is wonderful. That all costs a lot of money, and the poor governments don't have the money. So where is the money going to come from? From the private sector. You have to make them join and so on. If the money was going to come from the private sector, from taxes that they are not paying and that they should pay, yes, fantastic. And there would be a lot of money in the pockets of the governments to deliver on those promises. But the theory is that you have to give to the private sector the whole provision of the services for them to deliver. And that has been a disaster. And that is based on the idea that there is no money, which is a complete lie. You know, there are trillions of savings, including from pension funds, in developed countries that are having to pay money to the banks for them to keep their money. That is the so-called negative interest rates. And they are, you know, having to think about the pensions that we'll have to pay in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, and their money in the banks is having negative interest rates, meaning they are losing money. Now, this is an extraordinary opportunity for developing countries to tap from that money that is there and that is available. Now, Argentina, which defaulted in the last 50 years at least 3 times, issued a couple of weeks ago government bonds with 100-year period.
Maturity.
Okay? Buy my bonds, I will pay them back in 100 years. And you would say, who would buy 100 years government from the Argentinian government that in the last 100 years defaulted I don't know how many times and so on? The thing is, there were more buyers than what they wanted to sell. They got $4 billion overnight on that emission of 100-year bonds. Why? Because they pay a high interest rate, of course. So the people don't think of the 100 years. They think that in few years they will get a percentage on their bonds, which is quite profitable. But okay, so that means that if you want to invest money in things that are reasonable, you know, and you will be able to pay back, you have all the money that you want available. What the World Bank is doing is to say no. Instead of issuing bonds and with those bonds pay for your railroads or roads or whatever you want to do with that money that the country needs for infrastructure, for development, and so on, you will give that to the private sector. A model that was developed in Brazil, not just for infrastructure, but also for hospitals and schools. So what is the model? The private sector will build the school and will get a contract over 20 years. They will clean the school, they will provide the security, and they will provide the lunches for the students so that the school director and the teachers only have to worry about education. Now you pack that together and you give the private sector a long-term contract, which is impossible to decipher. How much will the school lunches or the security or the cleaning cost in 20 years? So you cannot compare that with any other offer. The private sector is getting indebted, going to the markets to raise the money to build that school and so on, because they have to build it before starting to charge something every year during 20 years. The World Bank gives them a guarantee. So they go to Wall Street and so on and said, hey, I am issued these private bonds with World Bank guarantee, so give me the money. So in the case of Brazil, one firm with a $50 million guarantee from the World Bank raised $2 billion from the market. Then you have this big firm, which is indebted to the public for $2 billion, because that's money from the public that they will have to pay or give an interest on that money. And you have only one possible client, because who is the only one that is going to buy your hospital or your school and so on? It's the government, federal government, municipal government, city government, whatever, but it's the government. Now, how do you do to make sure that the government buys your product and not somebody else's? Well, you do two things. First, you enter into a cartel with the other construction firms. This is for me, that is for you, that is for the other, and then you bribe the government authorities. Now, this firm called Odebrecht, has now all its chief executives in jail in Brazil, and the model that was so successfully praised by the World Bank and exported to all of Latin America and to Africa is probably now going to bring 6 or 7 presidents more all around the region and so on to jail for corruption. And they had to pay $2.6 billion in fines to the United States. Only in fine, $2.6 million, imagine. So it's this PPP models is the universalization of corruption, but it's not that a bad apple or, oh, this was a wrong guy. It's implicit in the model. It's a requirement of the model that you have corruption, not an accident. And by that, you end up destroying democracy and destroying any credibility of the system, not just destroying the corporations themselves, but destroying the state and the democracy. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Second speaker. Do you want to go?
Sure. Why do we bother with the United Nations if the power is in the World Bank, IMF, and WTO? Why? Because when we, some of us, years ago when we started moving into the trade area and the finance area, we realized that because of the lack of transparency in the economic power, institutions, we discovered that our own politicians and government policy makers and negotiators were actually they lacked the capacity to even know what was the implication of all these agreements. And I think for us in the civil society movement, where we spent so much of our early years at the national level, at the local level, fighting the politicians, who had bad laws and bad policies. And of course, when we went out to the global level where most of the decisions are being made, we realized our governments were really so ill-prepared. And so one of the things that I think has been done very systematically in the last 20 years is where civil society groups have engaged with the economic system in terms of the negotiations. And I think in this region and in Indonesia, right after each of the financial crises, when the IMF comes to our countries and then begins to negotiate in secret, all these deals with conditions on the economy and the people, there was just no the lack of transparency and when we get hold of the documents that our governments negotiate with bank loans and trade agreements or investment agreements, is horrifying. And I think one of and so we have actually gone and directly engaged. So WTO, we fought to get access, so we get accredited. Of course, in Argentina, we're not allowed to go next week. But we went and we sat in the corridors, we built those relationships, and then we got the text, we make them put everything online as much as they can. So in the WTO today, quite a lot of the submissions are actually online. If you look at so it is building human resource capacity to be able to analyze. And we find that most of our governments in the South, and we also find that many governments in Europe and other places, the people in the health or agriculture ministries or the social welfare ministries in even Europe, for example, know very little about the trade negotiations and the impact on their policy making. So when we enter that arena, we realize that we can do a lot, because we then, I think in the trade arena and with free trade agreements, the leaking of documents, forcing the information to be out there, we have been able to stop a lot of things or delay. I mean, in Malaysia, for example, we launched a huge campaign when our government was negotiating a bilateral agreement with the United States. And for different reasons, we worked with our colleagues in the US and all that, and we managed to actually stall it so long that a political moment came. It was never completed. Malaysia is the only country where a US bilateral negotiation started on a trade agreement and it was never finished. And in the end, some of the strongest opposition came from within the government. Other ministries were really giving a hard time to the trade ministry. So we are fighting all this. So I think engaging is important, and the UN sets the norms. We do not want the international institutions to come and tell us what to do, because in the end, the national priorities have to be determined nationally. But because, as we have talked about, there's so many aspects which are cross-border, and powerful countries and institutions do things that impact on the more vulnerable, we need those international norms. So I think we are talking about building and rebuilding and recapturing the United Nations norms, and there are lots and lots of human rights instruments. The Special Rapporteur, there was a huge thing about a couple of years ago. All the African countries which are part of a regional organization on intellectual property, without consulting even at the national level fully, this organization came up with a treaty that basically would close up seeds as private property, affecting millions of farmers and their right to sell and save seeds. So the campaign started really after the agreement was going to be signed almost, but enough mobilizing, to support, and everybody got together at the regional level, at some of the countries, and from outside, did an analysis, and then there was a campaign to approach all the human rights rapporteurs. And so all the human rights rapporteurs got together and signed a letter sent to every head of state in the African membership of ARIPO, and that managed to push back some of the worst provisions. So I think the challenge for us when we talk about systemic economic flaws is then to engage and to get in there. And I think we've also brought economic issues back to the United Nations, because the UN was sidelined. Deal with the soft things, but leave the economic issues to the WTO and Bretton Woods. And I think we are challenging that a lot. In terms of the medicine, very quickly, you see, medicines were not even something we would imagine would be patented. Most countries did not allow patenting of medicines. So this whole thing about, patents around medicines and seeds is a very new thing. It's only like 20-odd years of, But I wanted to raise the issue of hepatitis C, because this is one medicine which, if you look at what should be invention or new to be given a 20-year monopoly, most of the medicines we have today should not even qualify. They're not really new molecules, right? You have 100 milligram dosage, 50 milligram dosage, you get 2 separate patents. So the whole debate around the kind of one medicine is surrounded by hundreds of patents most of the time, right? And then you find that monopoly is being challenged. So in the case of hepatitis C, what is interesting is we talk about competition. If you have competition and you don't lock up and give all these extended patents on medicines, then you allow a lot of companies. So you have more domestic production, you have independence from dependency on one company, and the prices go down. And in the case of this one medicine, the countries that did not allow a patent, Egypt being one of them, could allow that medicine to be made available. So many countries are now actually looking at the possibility of remedying the abuse of patents, and there are within the system ways you can do it. So when Malaysia issued a few weeks ago a license for the government, and we patented this medicine in Malaysia, and they negotiated for 2 years, and they were treated with such arrogance from the drug company, from the patent holder. And that's why the country in the end decided to actually issue a license to import generics. Now, the Dutch Minister of Health has just said last week that Holland is going to explore using a compulsory license because even Holland cannot afford this medicine. So this one medicine, I think, is like, it's really a battle not just of the poor countries. OECD countries cannot afford it. The United States has the most expensive one. Okay, $1,000 US a pill a day for 12 weeks. So this is a challenge of the whole system. We should not allow medicines to be patented, and that's where the battleground is. And I think a lot of these issues are going to come up. The moments are there for us to be able to actually do a lot more, and the challenge to us is how do we come together. And I think what is so exciting about this region is that the space may be sort of challenged for civil society, but look at the rich research, the academia. In the worst moments when we cannot have the freedom to operate democratically, it is really when the intellectual work is being done. So the e-commerce new agreement that they want to push in Buenos Aires in the next couple of weeks is not about shopping online. Most of our governments think it's about shopping online, and it's not. It is really one of the most dangerous things. You know, we call it Singapore issues, e-commerce. Go into the details. It's all about taking away the right to regulate, opening up our markets, and then having no accountability. So we hope that we don't have a new agreement on e-commerce, because unless we know what it is and what the implications are, none of our governments should be signing anything. So now that most NGOs are being not allowed to enter Argentina for whatever reason, I think we should start a campaign. We were talking about it the last one day. We should start a campaign to boycott the ministerial in Buenos Aires and buy some time to fight all those nasty new agreements.
Okay, so Nabil is right. Boycotting maybe is better.
But do the homework first before you call for a boycott.
Why not just put all of our efforts where the power is, in that sense? Because it is more corporate captured than anywhere else. If you look at the policies and the directions that are coming from the WTO and the IMF, etc., they are more dominated and serving the interests of fewer people. And I think that the externalities, what a strange way to use that word, I mean, the failure of those policies basically are driving violence and conflict and extremism, lack of jobs, all kinds of different issues that are taking place there, increased inequalities. And I have to say that I don't know about anybody else, I will not be going there to ask them to respect my human rights. And nor am I prepared to give up on my human rights. Civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and more. I still want us to fight for more in that particular area. In terms of where we are with that conversation, I think it's a very interesting conversation. A lot of developing countries are trying to get out of these bilateral investment treaties. Some of what has just been discussed, people are learning on the capacity, the human resources question, and so on. But of course, some of those agreements meant that you're tied in for 10 years even if you leave. You know, the kinds of things that are, I mean, I don't know, but there's a lot there. I think this is related to that question and also to human resources in terms of also the way we measure progress, if we allow that approach to be the only approach. Because the way you measure progress there is by the GDP. You don't measure progress by well-being or more people being educated, or you measure progress quarterly, and you define recession by 2 successive quarters of growth going down, basically. What would happen if we changed the definition to 2 successive quarters of increased inequalities? What would happen to the policies then, or the lending arrangements for the IMF, or something like that? So I think that that also contributes, because of that, to the undermining of what we need in terms of spaces, institutional spaces, thinking that can look long-term. You need longer-term thinking to do job retraining. You need longer-term thinking to do environmental investment with regard to climate change. So I think these things all kind of come together. And so I think that if we concentrate only in those spaces, the bottom line is we empower them even more. So that would be why I resist. It's not an either-or, but I certainly would resist from that particular point of view. The other thing I'd like to say is that there are, small and medium states are not able to negotiate in the same way, and they are looking for different areas to negotiate. And that is something new that we need to explore further, and there have been some conversations here about that as well. I'll skip a couple of the others because I know there's a time question here. Leave no one behind. Is it realistic?
What does it mean?
What does it mean exactly? If you look at the language, it also says reach the furthest first, which is quite interesting. Now, when the phrase developed during the negotiations, I really didn't like it. Because the concept implicit in it, to me, is that everything's fine and we just have some people that we need to bring along into the existing system and the way it works, okay? And I still feel like that about it. When you actually look at it, in fact, implicitly, it is being interpreted to mean reach all different social groups in terms of discrimination from that point of view, but not challenge all policies in terms of what we're talking about here. And when you say leave no one behind, I would like to put the wealthy, the top 1%, as part of what we can't leave behind, because those policies need to be changed too. That's not how it's being interpreted either. So on the one hand, it's mobilizing, very interestingly, some social groups that really, in terms of poor people, in terms of indigenous, it's being used creatively at a rights level. But it's not challenging the kinds of conversations that we're having here, which have been talked about in terms of paradigm shift and so on. I mean, I think one of the things that we should really be doing going forward is actually talking about a wealth index, not talking about GDP. We need to add, as we start to measure some of these issues, we can bring in some of these different kinds of areas. But maybe that's I'm just very quickly looking at what have I got here. I think that's as far as...
Thank you. Last but not least, the floor is yours.
شكرا. فقط أجوبة سريعة على الملاحظات والأسئلة. أولا بالنسبة للدولة الديمقراطية التنموية، دولة تنموية ليست ديمقراطية على التجربة التاريخية. ربما هذه المقولة يجب أن نحتاط منها، لأننا ننظر فقط إلى الجنوب وننظر أكثر إلى شرق آسيا. وفعلا في كوريا الجنوبية، في سنغافورة، في تايوان، في هونغ كونغ كانت أنظمة سلطوية قوية بنفس استراتيجي وبرؤية من أجل يعني بناء تصنيع قوي على شاكلة اليابان، نموذج الياباني. لكن حين ننظر إلى فرنسا بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية، فرنسا بنت اقتصادها خاصة في عهد جنرال دوغول على قطاع عام صناعي ومالي قوي. لا ريجي رونو، شركة رونو هي مؤسسة عمومية في الأصل، ولحد الآن لا زالت للدولة الفرنسية في لا ريجي دو رونو، ريجي رونو وكالة، يعني شركة الآن ولات أصبح شركة مجهولة الاسم، سوسيتي أنونيم. رونو تقريبا 15% من رأس المال. فربما أعطيك ذلك المثال في شمال أوروبا، بمعنى أنه هناك ديمقراطية سياسية مش ديمقراطية اقتصادية واجتماعية. في نظام رأسمالي، وهناك دولة تنموية بنت التصنيع ولها قطاع عام قوي وتوفرت على وسائل المال والتمويل من أجل النهوض بفرنسا بعد طبعا الهدم الذي حدث من جراء الحرب العالمية الثانية. فإذا أظن ليس هناك تناقض بين الديمقراطية والدولة التنموية. النقطة الثانية وهي مرتبطة بقضية الاندماج جنوب وبالنسبة للعالم العربي، أنا لم أتكلم كثيرا عن القافطة، يعني عن المنطقة العربية الحرة الكبرى. الفكرة فيما يخص الاندماج الإقليمي كانت سائدة فكرة قبل 10 سنوات، أو أنه نبني تكتلات إقليمية، الخليج، المشرق العربي ثم المغرب العربي. وفعلا كانت ربما نظريا فكرة يعني مش بطالة، لكن لما نأخذ مثلا بلدان المغرب العربي ماذا نلاحظ؟ نلاحظ أنها مرتبطة ارتباط وثيق بأوروبا، بالاتحاد الأوروبي، والمنتوجات المغربية تنافس المنتوجات التونسية في السوق الأوروبية، وما يمكن أن نتبادله قليل لأن البنيات الاقتصادية هشة. لنا صناعات خفيفة، لنا فوسفات في المغرب، هناك البترول فعلا في الجزائر، تونس لها بعض القطاعات التي انتعشت، ولكن يعني الأفق الاندماج القوي غير موجودة، بالإضافة إلى العوائق السياسية. مثلا بين المغرب والجزائر هناك حدود مقفلة منذ 23 سنة، منذ 1994 لحد الآن. كيف يمكن أن يكون هناك اندماج؟ ثم هناك فكرة أنه يجب أن تستفيد كل دولة. مثلا هناك اتفاقية أكادير وهي اتفاقية تبادل الحر، خاصة بالنسبة للمنتوجات المصنعة بين المغرب وتونس والأردن ومصر. المستفيد الأكبر هي مصر، نظرا ربما نسيجها الاقتصادي المتطور نسبيا مقارنة مع البلدان الأخرى، وبالتالي هذا يحدث عائق بالنسبة لبلد كالمغرب الذي يعتبر نفسه هو الخاسر الأكبر في الاتفاقية، وهذا لا يحث المغرب على انخراط أكثر في التبادل التجاري، وبالتالي يحدث نوع من العوائق غير الجمركية، non-tariff barriers. فكرة الجنوب مهمة جدا، والاندماج جنوب ربما قد يكون أسهل، لأن الفرق في البنيات الاقتصادية بين دول الجنوب ليس بالشساعة التي تميز العلاقات مع بلدان متقدمة كثيرا. هذا نظريا، ولكن ماذا يقع مثلا الآن في إفريقيا؟ هناك مشروع طموح يناقش من طرف وزراء التجارة ووزراء الخارجية حول إنشاء منطقة تبادل الحر قارية على مستوى إفريقيا كلها، أي بمعنى 53 دولة ستندمج من خلال التبادل الحر. ماذا؟ هناك عوائق طبيعية، لأنه إذا اعتمدنا التبادل الحر كآلية أساسية للاندماج سيكون هناك رابحون وخاسرون. في الفلاحة من سيربح هم الأجري بيزنس، المقاولات القوية والكبيرة التي لها الإمكانية في التصدير وفي المنافسة. وما هو مصير الفلاحين الصغار؟ البلدان القوية الآن المفاوضات متوقفة لأن البلدان الأقل نمو شافت أنها ستكون كبش الفداء داخل إفريقيا، فبالتالي رفضت، والآن المفاوضات متوقفة لأن منطق السوق هو الغالب. فبالتالي نعم يجب التشجيع تعاون جنوب جنوب، ولكن على أساس أولا التعاون والتآزر. آلية السوق يمكن أن تشتغل، ولكن يجب أن لا تكون هدف في حد ذاتها. يعني نبني القدرات الإنتاجية ثم نحرر، بمعنى أنه يجب أن يكون هناك نوع من التوقيت الزمني في إطار ربما مراحل كي يتمكن كل البلدان من الاستفادة من الاندماج الإقليمي، وهذا هو أهمية جنوب جنوب. شكرا.
شكرا دكتور. Allow me to thank all the speakers on your behalf. I think that they deserve a big applause from everybody. And I also want to thank you for bearing with us all this time until late now. And I want also to thank the Issam Faris Institute team for also all the services and the support they provided for us, and they deserve also. Of course, AND team, and I want also to thank all the translators who started working with us yesterday at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they are still here with us. So thank you very much. And I invite you all to have a look on the website. This report, everything what has been said here is in this book. So thank you very much, and see you later.